Okay, good morning, GCM with First Blood. Good morning, Trish. Good morning, Danny. Let's talk about Hamas and the war in the Middle East because, whew, here we go. All right, good morning. Good morning. Okay, we're going to talk this morning a little bit about what's going on in the Middle East, the Hamas attack on Israel. And, you know, there's going to be a lot of people out there wanting me to say stuff about the Jews and whatnot. But, you know, the real problem is a little closer to home. It's always difficult to cover events like this so close to the event occurring because, of course, I'm not a journalist, right? I'm not out on the ground gathering that information, reporting. I do analysis and opinion. Now, my background and what makes me competent to do the analysis is my background in military intelligence, where I have training and education particularly tailored to understand the complexities of how events shape the battlefield. And, of course, for the past, God, has it been 10 years now that we've been doing the Brushfire Mind? That expertise has been bolstered with thousands of hours, literally thousands of hours of applying that talent and that skill set to the analysis of politics, American politics, local politics, and geopolitics. Which, of course, was part of my initial training and experience in being able to conduct analysis to generate actionable intelligence with which we could prosecute the enemy. Enemies, which I might add, included indeed Hamas. While my training my original training was in a different particular region. The fact is that my applicable military experience was spent in the Middle East. to include a long tour of duty in Afghanistan, conducting active war, prosecuting the enemies of the United States of America who happen to be parts of organizations like Hamas. Now, I was more involved, obviously, with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda than with Hamas. And by involved, I mean I found them where they slept and made them die there, which I'll admit is something I very fondly miss. It was the best and worst time of my life. Now, that said, as we're looking at what happened over the weekend, Hamas attacked Israel. The news reports so far say that the death toll is over 1,000. I suspect that number will be much higher. Hamas launched rockets and let me see. Cameron says, meh, the Jews, not the Jews. Hard to be sad about a group of Muslim psychos getting their 72 virgins early. Agreed. Good work should be rewarded. That reward should never be too late in coming. So, when we look at the situation in the Middle East, of course, the early reporting goes immediately to the political. There's a lot of posturing and chest thumping going on social media from the usual suspects, the Krasensteins, Brooklyn Dad Defiant, those guys, people you've seen over and over again who have the worst takes. Of course, Jordan Peterson had possibly the best take on this in response to Victorian socialists saying solidarity to the Palestinian resistance. And Jordan B. Peterson simply says, "You murderous anti-Semitic rats." Now, it's not hard to find a large swath of murderous anti-Semitic rats. I mean, we after all have the Squad. And Rashida Tlaib, of course, has already had her very clever take on the situation. But at issue for our concerns is that almost immediately, and this article comes from the New York Post, of course, it's being politicized in the American general election primary campaigns. And the way it's being politicized, frankly, to me, is somewhat hilarious. Essentially, the Republicans are being accused of politicizing the event before they have had a chance to politicize the event. So from the New York Post, we have Hamas attacks on Israel funded by Biden, GOP 2024 candidates say. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I want to read the article. Some critics tore into President Joe Biden as being responsible for Hamas's assault on Israel Saturday by providing billions to Iran, which funds and supports the terrorist group. In September, the Biden administration allowed the transfer of $6 billion in frozen assets to Iran, which funds and supports Hamas, in exchange for the release of 5 Americans. The White House stressed at the time that Iran could only use the funds for food, medicine, medical equipment that would not have a dual military use. Now, before I read the rest of that statement, I want to pop over here. Brooklyn Dad Defiant is one of those very popular commies on Twitter that always has the just most well-considered rants and takes on things. Let me say something about the $6 billion right-wing media is busy spreading disinformation about. One, that wasn't our money. None of it was taxpayer money, not a single penny. It was Iran's money that had been frozen and released. Okay, false. Need I remind you, Brooklyn Dad Defiant, that Iran got a lot of its money from Barack Hussein Obama. In fact, let's see. According to the internets, Obama sent $1.7 billion to Iran, followed by $1.3 billion, which brings us up to a little over $3 billion total. There's a little better than half. And there were several other payments from the Obama administration in hard cash directly to Iran, which I'm sure many of you will recall were of notable controversy at the time, some 10 years ago, a little less. And that's not the end of it. Let's also not forget programs not unlike Obama's Cash for Clunkers that were run in the Middle East, like the Cash for Work program that I had direct involvement with while I was in Afghanistan, where the Obama administration ran a program where they would deliver pallets of cash to American soldiers in the Middle East. It was cash in the local Afghani currency, right? And the program, we bought a bunch of tools, shovels and spades and pitchforks and the like, things for cleaning up the street. And okay, hang on, let me slow down. There's a lot of details to try and lay out to make this point so that you understand it. Okay. In Afghanistan, as in much of the Middle East, the people are, well, they're nasty. They're disgusting. They shit in the streets. They throw their trash in the street. I mean, the streets in these little burbs are filthy. They're literally covered in human feces, the droppings of livestock, and trash. Food wrappers, dirty diapers, just trash. And I mean covered. Literally covered. And at one point, operating the Cash for Work program, as it was called, what would be done? Okay, what would be done normally is there'd be, they'd set up a little checkpoint, and they would hand out tools in the morning, shovels and rakes and picks and the like, and they would hand those out to the locals. The locals would go away and then come back at the end of the day and turn in the tools and be handed cash money. Ostensibly, what they were doing with the tools was cleaning up the streets and working their farms, right? Now, without going into too much detail because of the nature of the NDAs that I've signed, a part of my job included surveillance. And so I personally watched and was unable to intervene as I watched these men and boys come and collect tools in the morning, go and lean the tools up against the side of a building where they would sit around, drink tea, play video games, watch television, where they would, do anything but use the tools to do work. And then they would come back, hand in the tools, and get their money at the end of the day. It looked very much like any other Democrat work program. Except then that money ended up doing things like funding IED emplacements, funding the building of bombs that were used to attack American soldiers, funding terrorism. I would, in fact, go so far as to say, much like the Obamacare plan, where the obvious outcome was the outcome that we received, and the activity was engaged despite intelligent men pointing out that the obvious outcome would be the obvious outcome, that it was done intentionally. And so one cannot reasonably conclude that having received the obvious outcome from the obvious probable pattern of events, that the obvious outcome was not, in fact, the intended outcome. Which is to say that Obama ran Cash for Clunkers in order to cause harm to the used car market. He ran Cash for Work explicitly for the purpose of laundering U.S. taxpayer dollars into the pockets of known terrorists on purpose. He delivered pallets of cash to Iran for the explicit purpose of funding the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism. And his butt boy protege, the Biden crime family, chose to unfreeze assets and supply those assets to Hamas, ostensibly through Iran, on September 11th, with the express intent of causing a war to occur as a result. That's the application of logic to the analytical capacity of the data available based on probable, predictable outcomes and the intent that cannot be attributed to incompetence when its repetition can only be explained by malice. The next point this knucklehead makes is that money is currently in a bank account in Qatar. It's not like the mullahs are rolling around in Scrooge McDuck money baths. And then the third point is it's similarly relates. The $6 billion in released funds can only be used by Iran for humanitarian purposes like food and medicine, and it's being closely monitored. Okay. Imagine for a moment that you are a household and you have a savings account set aside specifically and particularly to fund a vacation trip. And when that account hits a certain amount at a certain date, right, the plan is to make reservations to get a beach cottage in Florida and go and play in the surf and enjoy the local cuisine, et cetera, et cetera. And then you're in a car accident. You're not at fault. There's almost no damage to the car, but technically there is damage. I actually had a similar occurrence. I've had a similar occurrence a couple times in my life where, you know, an insurance company writes me a check to fix those damages, and you look say, this is cosmetic, and I've got more use for the money. Okay, but that money is for fixing the car. It doesn't go into the account for the vacation. But suddenly, that money's there. And maybe you do fix the car, you just get a good deal, and then you spend a little bit more on, you have a little bit of money there left over, and you spend that on some groceries. Groceries that didn't come out of money that could have otherwise gone into that other account. My point is that the money is fungible. And what Brooklyn Dad here says, the $6 billion in released funds can only be used by Iran for humanitarian purposes. That they have the money is that they have the money. Money is always fungible. That one account is only earmarked to pay for X, Y, and Z doesn't mean that another account can't pay for it more easily, because the existence of the, let's say, hypothetical humanitarian account is there to offset the costs that would otherwise be covered by the general account. Money is fungible. That they have $6 billion is that they have $6 billion. The idea that that money does not in any way affect their ability to bankroll, I don't know, an attack that happened immediately and obviously, right? The next thing you're going to tell me is that Vladimir Putin was totally up on funds to cover the Ukrainian invasion before he was able, due to U.S. incompetence and economic disaster decision-making, he was totally unsupplied by his ability to extort uh, European nations over fuel costs. So to be clear, I am not only saying that Joe Biden and the American administrative state funded Iran with the, which allowed Iran to fund Hamas, which allowed Hamas to conduct these attacks. I'm saying that they did it openly, notoriously, and intentionally with the explicit stated end purpose of it's not that they wanted Israel to be attacked in particular. It's that the Biden administration and his ilk want war ongoing. And I'm not just saying all that. I'm saying that this is not the first time they have done it. Look at the course of history, with the exception of the Gulf War situation throughout the 90s. Conflict between the United States and other nations begins with a Democrat and ends with a Republican. That is the general trend. People like to think of the Republicans as the war party, as the party of war hawks, right? Those people have not read history generally. That is essentially a brush that the Republicans were painted with through the 90s to, there was actually a really important purpose there. The Democrats wanted to get the military and military veterans out of the business of running for office. Running an incompetent shit sack, obvious Democrat sympathizer, pro-war nut job like W was part of that maneuver. I think there's a high degree of probability that we can look back over that history and the corruption that appeared to have taken place in those elections and say that the electoral process may have died before Bill Clinton took office. That said, what we're looking at, the general rules here as Brooklyn Dad is trying to paint them, says the $6 billion is released funds can only be used by Iran for humanitarian purposes. What did Iran say? The White House stressed, right? I started this sentence and said we'd get back to it. The White House stressed at the time that Iran could only use the funds for food, medicine, medical equipment that would not have a dual military use. But Iran waived off the terms and publicly boasted they would deploy the cash wherever we need it. So I made the arguments that the idea of the money being earmarked specifically against a military purpose is a weak argument because of the fungibility of funds and the fact that having the money, even in separate fund buckets, does not offset the ability of the money, which is earmarked away for specific non-military funds, from bolstering the ability of the military to conduct its activities nonetheless. I made all those points to make it very clear that I don't even need this. And then Iran goes out and says, we don't give a shit. We'll spend that money on guns if we want to. So, Brooklyn Dad defiant, you're still an idiot. And he says, if Iran tries to use that money for anything other than humanitarian purposes, the United States will freeze the money again. If you go spend all your money on cocaine and hookers, I'm going to take your money away from you. I already spent all my money on cocaine and hookers, so, okay. I have the cocaine and hookers. And I spent all my money on it. Oh God, please don't take all my money away. Fucking morons. Yeah. Let's set the record straight. Repost this like crazy. Krasenstein has a similar take. Do you know what's disgusting to me? People in America try to compare Mexicans and Central Americans coming over the U.S. border to Hamas terrorists attacking Israel and killing civilians. Where do you even get that shit? You're right. They are two very different things. One is a physical attack, a kinetic attack, while the other is an ongoing invasion by a hostile foreign political entity. So you're right. They are dissimilar, but not in the way that you think. They're still both offensive, military, deliberate strategy maneuvers. The Krasensteins, man. And Styx's take, Hamas is reasonable comparable to some of the more organized drug cartels on the border. Abso-fucking-lutely. Afghanistan had a wonderfully vibrant and successful opium and marijuana trade going on, which was used explicitly to fund terrorist activities. When I was over there during the Obama administration, Obama put in place a set of rules of engagement, which were ostensibly designed to protect the local economy and food supply, and were worded such that to the casual observer, it read that you're not allowed to burn down fruit trees. In practical application, what it meant was you're not allowed to cause damage or risk to bring to damage any crop which has economic value, which is to say that Barack Obama ordered the U.S. military to go out of its way to protect crops of opium and marijuana. And this went so far, I shit you not, that the enemy was aware of it and incorporated it into their strategic activities. They would launch mortars. They would launch 80 millimeter recoilless rifles, which they essentially used as mortars, but which is not the way you use a recoilless rifle, But anyway, they would launch indirect fire attacks from opium fields, from marijuana fields, from vegetable crops, from fruit-bearing trees, because they knew that we weren't allowed to return fire on them while they were in those crops. They would launch and just stay there because our soldiers would not even go into the crops to return fire and hunt down the attackers. And I have to be a little careful about how I say this, but I and some of my equipment were special enough that in the interest of protecting my equipment, we got to make some extra moves. Well, I actually had a different set of rules of engagement for particular situations like that. So, yeah, the infantry guys just loved having me around because I got to say, no, fuck your ROE. My ROE comes first. You burn them out. But yeah, we lost a lot of soldiers in Afghanistan because Barack Obama, with whom served former Vice President Joe Biden, went out of his way to make it harder for the United States Army to fight against Islamic terrorists. Went out of his way to defend, protect, and fund Islamic terrorists. What you are seeing now is just another extension of the Obama administration into its third term through the puppet of Joe Biden, who is working hard to fund and defend the enemies of the United States of America to our explicit detriment and to the detriment of our allies. And the fact of the matter is, whatever you might think of Israel, they are an American ally. And this isn't the first one. Joe Biden is responsible for the war between Russia and Ukraine. He made that happen. Now, don't get me wrong. They were going that direction for a long time, right? The annexation of Crimea happened before Donald Trump. But while Trump was in office, there were no new wars. Russia did not make aggressive actions. North Korea backed way the hell off of its saber rattling and posturing. The Taliban was cowed, and the Abraham Accords were in place. We were right on the brink of peace breaking out in the Middle East. And then an election was stolen. And the very first thing that Biden did after he was inaugurated was to shut down the American energy sector, with the obvious and expressed outcome of shifting funding to the Middle East and to Russia. And that funding is being used to wage wars. No new wars under Trump. And then Biden gets in office, and there are two things happening, making more wars happen around the world. Biden is funding those wars with American taxpayer dollars, and he is showing a weak America to the world and making a non-intervention promise that war will not only be tolerated, but the evils perpetrated against evil civilians will not only be tolerated, they will be funded and they will be profiteered upon by American interests. That is what the Biden administration represents, and that is what you will be voting for if you vote that way come next November. So I've said it before, and I'll say it again, and we're going to keep repeating the mantra. When it comes to November of 2024, you can vote for war and child trafficking, or you can vote for world peace and cheap gas. So we'll keep drilling on that. We love you. Thanks for watching this morning. We will see you tomorrow. Incidentally, we'll be on Rumble tomorrow, just in case.